They almost didn't let her in the room. Not because of a rule, not because of a policy printed in some binder. Because of the way she looked standing at the door, 5'4", 19 years old, a ponytail that kept slipping to the left no matter how many times she fixed it. The guy at the registration desk looked at her the way people look at a lost dog that somehow ended up at a wedding. Confused, a little annoyed, waiting for someone to come claim it. She handed him her credentials. He read them twice. Then, he looked at her again, like maybe the paper was wrong. Like maybe there had been a mix-up somewhere down the line, and the real person whose name was on that paper was a 6-foot man with a handshake that could crack walnuts. He stamped her badge. He didn't say welcome. He didn't say anything. Just slid it across the desk and turned back to his phone. She clipped it to her jacket and walked into the building. That was the beginning. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe the beginning was 3 years earlier in a gymnasium that smelled like old rubber mats and somebody's forgotten lunch in a town in Oklahoma where the biggest thing that ever happened was a water tower getting painted the wrong shade of blue and everybody arguing about it for 6 months. Maybe the beginning was her father sitting in a folding chair with a torn armrest, watching her practice, saying nothing, just watching, the way only people who understand something deeply can watch it in someone else. Her name was Mara Callahan, and on the morning that 301 Navy SEALs walked into that auditorium and took their seats, not one of them knew her name. She had grown up the kind of quiet that people mistake for shy. It wasn't shyness. Shyness is about fear. What Mara had was something else, a preference for observation over announcement. She watched how things worked before she moved. She studied the room before she entered it. In school, teachers called on her less because she never raised her hand, and they assumed silence meant empty. It didn't. Her brain ran like a factory on night shift, constant, invisible, producing things nobody saw until the product showed up fully formed. Her father, Ray Callahan, was a former Marine. Not the kind who puts a sticker on his truck. The kind who doesn't talk about it, and doesn't need to. He'd done 2 tours, and come back different in the specific way that combat makes a person different, quieter in crowds, alert in restaurants, always sitting with his back to a wall. He worked at a supply depot after he got out. He coached Mara's youth wrestling team when she was 8 because nobody else wanted to do it, and he couldn't stand watching kids waste a good sport. He never treated her differently because she was a girl. That's the thing people always want to make into a big speech. It wasn't a speech. It was just Tuesday. She came to practice, she drilled, she got thrown, she got up, she drilled again. Ray Callahan did not adjust his expectations based on her gender any more than he adjusted them based on the weather. You showed up. You worked. That was the deal. By the time Mara was 12, she was the best wrestler in her age group in the county. By 14, the state was paying attention. By 16, college scouts were calling the house phone. The one Ray refused to replace with a cell number because he said if someone really wanted to reach him, they could call a landline like a person with patience. Mara used to stand in the kitchen doorway and listen to him take those calls. He was always polite. He always said thank you. He always said he'd pass the message along. He never pushed her toward anything. He never pointed at the phone and said, "Do you hear that? That's your future." He just passed the message along. She made her own decisions. That was the point. The facility where the event was being held was about 40 minutes outside of San Diego, on a stretch of land that felt like it existed in a different atmospheric layer than the rest of California. Drier, flatter, more serious. It was a defense and special operations training complex, and the event itself was a closed demonstration put together by a joint initiative between the DoD and 3 private sector contractors who were evaluating new approaches to combat readiness assessment. Which sounds like a lot of words that mean nothing, and mostly it was. But buried inside the agenda, between a panel discussion on tactical dehydration and a demonstration of some new load-bearing equipment, there was a 30-minute slot labeled simply, Physical Assessment Demo, Open Evaluation. That was Mara's slot. She'd been invited by a woman named Dr. Patricia Osei, who ran a research program at a university in Arizona that studied applied human performance. Dr. Osei had found Mara through a paper, a real academic paper, published in a journal that exactly 43 people in the country read regularly, about unconventional resistance training adaptations in female athletes. Mara had been one of the subjects in the study. She'd also, without being asked, written a 17-page addendum to the study's methodology section, pointing out 3 variables the researchers had failed to account for. Dr. Osei had called her the next week. That call led to a program. That program led to 18 months of work that Mara did mostly alone in a converted garage in Tucson that she rented for $200 a month from a retired chemistry teacher named Harold, who asked no questions and charged no additional fees as long as she didn't mess with his orchids. She did not mess with his orchids. What she did in that garage for 18 months is the part of the story that sounds impossible until you understand the specifics, and the specifics are where the story lives. Mara Callahan was not a typical athlete. She was not going to be an Olympian. Her body type, her joints, her specific combination of fast twitch and slow twitch muscle composition, none of it pointed toward any single elite competitive sport in the traditional sense. She was not going to outsprint a sprinter. She was not going to outlift a powerlifter. What she had, what Dr. Osei's study had identified, and what Mara had known about herself since she was 14 without having words for it, was something the research called adaptive load integration. In plain language, under pressure, under fatigue, under conditions of increasing physical and cognitive stress, Mara's performance degraded at roughly one-third the rate of a statistically average trained male athlete. She didn't peak faster. She didn't crash slower. The curve itself was different. Most athletes, male or female, trained or elite, follow a performance curve that looks like a hill. They build, they peak, they fall. Fatigue accumulates. Decision-making degrades. Physical output drops. It's biology. It's physics. There's no shame in it. Mara's curve looked more like a plateau with a very long tail. She didn't peak as high. In a single explosive moment, a 40-yard dash, a 1-rep max, she would lose to athletes with conventional profiles. But at the 2-hour mark, the 4-hour mark, at the point where everyone else was running on fumes and cortisol and whatever stubbornness they had left in their spinal cord, Mara Callahan was still performing at 83% of her personal baseline. Dr. Osei had called it in the paper a rare and potentially significant physiological anomaly. Mara had underlined the word anomaly in pencil and written in the margin, or just a different shape. The 18 months in the garage were about building a protocol. If her body worked differently than the standard model, then standard training methods were at best neutral, and at worst, actively working against what made her unusual. Training designed to push you to a peak does not train you to maintain a plateau. They're different problems. They require different solutions. Mara read everything she could find on endurance science, on thermoregulation, on neurological fatigue, on the physiology of sleep deprivation, and how the brain prioritizes motor function when resources are being rationed. She read papers from military research programs. She found a study from the Israeli Defense Forces from 2009 that nobody seemed to have followed up on. She emailed the lead researcher, a man named Dr. Yitzhak Berman, who was by then retired and living in Haifa and apparently very bored because he wrote back within 20 minutes and they ended up corresponding for 4 months. She built her protocol piece by piece. She tested it on herself with a rigor that was, by any clinical standard, slightly reckless. She kept detail logs. She adjusted variables one at a time. She failed often in a specific and useful way that failure is useful when you're paying attention, each one telling her something she didn't know before. She put on 12 pounds of muscle over the 18 months. She dropped her resting heart rate to 41 beats per minute. She developed the ability to sustain complex problem-solving tasks, math, navigation, tactical puzzles, for up to 90 minutes past the point where cognitive fatigue would typically cause significant degradation. Harold, the retired chemistry teacher, occasionally brought her tea through the garage door and didn't ask questions. When Dr. Osei saw the 18 months of logs, she was quiet for a long time. Then, she said, "I think you need to show someone this." Mara had said, "Who?" Dr. Osei had a list. The auditorium at the facility seated about 400 people. On the morning of the demonstration, it held 301. They were mostly men. Not entirely. There were maybe 20 women in the room, most of them researchers, analysts, a few in uniform. But the dominant presence in that room was the kind of presence you feel before you see it, a physical density, a collective stillness that comes from people who have trained their bodies into instruments and then spent years learning how instruments sit. Navy SEALs do not fidget. They observe. They assess. They make calculations in real time that most people don't know they're making. They had been told they were there to see a physical assessment demonstration. Most of them had interpreted this as someone is going to do pull-ups and we are going to evaluate the methodology. When Mara walked in from the side door, ponytail slightly off-center, credential badge clipped to a jacket that was a size too big because she'd grabbed it off a hook in the hallway without checking. The room did not change. Nobody whispered. Nobody laughed. But the temperature shifted. It was subtle, the way a room's temperature shifts when everyone in it has the same thought at the same time, and nobody says it out loud. The thought was, this is the demonstration? A man in the third row, broad-shouldered, mid-30s, the particular kind of calm that comes from having been in genuinely frightening situations and surviving them, leaned slightly toward the colleague beside him and said quietly enough that it wasn't meant to carry. They sent us a kid. It carried. Mara heard it. She heard it the way she'd been hearing variations of it for 19 years. In the gymnasium at 8 years old, when she showed up to a boys' tournament because the girls' bracket didn't have enough participants. In high school, when she asked the football coach if she could use the weight room during off hours. In the first phone call she'd made to a DoD liaison about the demonstration, when the man on the other end had said, and who will be presenting the research, and she'd said, I will, and there had been a pause that lasted just a half second too long. She heard it. She set her bag down. She looked at the room, not at any one person, at the room as a whole, the way you look at a problem you've already decided to solve, and she said, in a voice that was level and unremarkable like someone reciting a grocery list, I'm going to need the longest course you have. The facility's assessment course was used for SEAL qualification testing. It was not designed to be impossible. It was designed to be, as one of the instructors had once described it, instructively brutal, which meant it would tell you exactly and precisely where you broke, and the information it delivered in the breaking was considered more valuable than a clean finish. The full course ran 4 hours and 20 minutes under standard evaluation conditions. It included water obstacles, load carries, cognitive assessment checkpoints, a rappelling section, a 9-mile run, and a final stage that the staff referred to simply as the problem, a tactical puzzle that had to be completed under simulated stress conditions with degraded resources. Most candidates who attempted the full course did not finish the problem, not because they couldn't solve the problem, because by the time they reached it, their brains had been underwater long enough that the wiring wasn't conducting properly. The facility director, a compact and excessively composed man named Commander Ellis, had looked at Mara when she said she wanted the full course, and had said, Miss Callahan, our longest course is 4 hours and 20 minutes under standard conditions. Are you aware of what that involves? She said she was. He said, it is not a demonstration course. It is a qualifying course. She said, I know. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he said, all right. They moved the demonstration outside. The 301 men and women in that auditorium filed out onto the observation platforms that ran alongside the course. Tiered concrete steps with railings, the kind of structure that exists specifically so people can watch other people attempt difficult things. Some of them brought coffee. A few of them pulled out tablets to take notes. The morning was cool, marine layers still sitting low, the light flat and gray and honest. Mara stood at the start line. She was wearing standard-issue training gear that she'd borrowed from the facility supply room. Not her own, because she hadn't known she'd need it, because she hadn't known she was going to ask for the full course until she was standing in that auditorium, hearing the word kid float through the air toward her like a slow pitch she could either watch go by or swing at. She decided to swing. A staff member handed her a hydration pack, a weighted vest, 45 pounds, standard issue, and a sealed envelope that contained the cognitive assessment prompts she would be required to complete at checkpoints 2, 4, and 7. She took all 3. She put on the vest. She put the envelope in her back pocket. She adjusted the hydration tube. She fixed her ponytail. The man who had said they send us a kid was standing on the observation platform 12 feet to her left. She did not look at him, not because she was avoiding him, because he was not the problem she was solving. The starter raised a hand. Mara's breathing slowed. This was the thing Ray Callahan had tried to teach, and eventually stopped trying to teach, because some things cannot be taught. They can only be recognized when they show up in someone, and you realize what you're looking at. When Mara Callahan was under pressure, her breathing slowed. Not deliberately, not as a technique. The way a gyroscope stabilizes when it spins, the mechanism responding to stress by doing the one thing stress is supposed to prevent. She became, under pressure, more herself. The hand dropped. She ran. The first mile was flat, which is where most people make their first mistake. Flat looks like an invitation to go fast. The body feels good. The legs feel strong. The morning air is cool and forgiving. And the brain, which is optimistic to a fault, says we should use this. Most candidates came out of the first mile too hot. They banked what they thought was time, what was actually energy, and by mile 3 the loan was coming due with interest. Mara came out of the first mile at a pace that, from the observation platforms, looked almost leisurely. Someone said it, not unkindly, with genuine puzzlement, the way you'd note a weather anomaly. She's going slow. Someone else said, pacing. The first person said, for a 4-hour course? Like pacing for a 4-hour course was a concept so obvious it had looped back around to being suspicious. She hit the water obstacle at the 18-minute mark. The water obstacle at this facility was a quarter-mile channel, 4 feet deep, with 3 submerged barriers that had to be navigated by feel because the water was murked with training dye, standard practice, so you couldn't see your hands in front of your face and had to trust your body's memory of where the barrier was based on the briefing diagram you'd been shown for 90 seconds before the start. Most candidates lost between 4 and 8 minutes in the channel, not from the physical difficulty, but from the decision paralysis that happens when you can't see and your brain starts arguing with your body about what to do next. Mara went through in 11 minutes, not because she was faster than everyone, because she trusted her hands. When her left palm found the first barrier, she didn't stop to verify. She moved. When the current shifted near the second barrier, a subtle hydraulic tell that wasn't in the briefing diagram because it wasn't supposed to be, it was just a quirk of the channel's construction that the staff had stopped mentioning years ago because nobody ever noticed it. She felt it adjusted, went right instead of left, and found the opening 3 feet sooner than the standard line. On the observation platform, one of the researchers had a stopwatch. She said, to no one in particular, 11 minutes. The man beside her, a seal, gray at the temples, the kind of quiet that is not the same as Mara's quiet but rhymes with it, said nothing. Just watched. Checkpoint 2 was at the 40-minute mark. The cognitive assessment at Checkpoint 2 was a navigation problem. Given a set of coordinates, limited instruments, and a scenario that assumed 2 of the instruments were malfunctioning, determined the correct route and estimated time to the objective. It was timed. Candidates had 4 minutes. Most candidates used 3 minutes and 40 seconds and got the answer approximately right. Mara completed it in 2 minutes and 11 seconds. She handed the sheet back to the checkpoint proctor, a young staff sergeant who was clearly not expecting the sheet back this soon because he'd been mid-bite of a granola bar, and she ran. The proctor looked at the sheet. He read it. He read it again. He picked up his radio. By the 2-hour mark, the observation platforms had gotten quieter. Not silent, but the quality of sound had changed. The easy commentary had thinned out, the coffee cups were mostly empty, and nobody had gone back for more. The tablets had mostly been put away. People were just watching. The way you watch something when you've stopped forming opinions about it, and started just receiving it. Mara was on mile 6. She was still at her pace. The pace that had looked slow at mile 1 now looked like something else. A metronome, a tide, something that was not going to vary because variation was not its nature. Her form had not deteriorated. The weighted vest, which by the 2-hour mark typically produces visible compensation patterns. Hips shifting, shoulders rolling, the body's unconscious negotiation with load, sat on her like it had always been there. The man who had said, "They sent us a kid," had not moved from his position on the platform. He had his arms crossed. He was watching her the way he probably watched a lot of things, with a face that gave nothing away and eyes that were filing everything. At some point in the second hour, he had uncrossed his arms. He hadn't noticed himself do it. At mile 7, she hit the rappelling section. The wall was 60 feet. Harness, rope, standard equipment. The rappel down was not the challenge. It was the ascending Jumar back up, full kit, after 2 hours of running. This was where candidates' hands gave out. Grip strength is one of the first things to go when the body starts rationing. The forearms fill with lactic acid, the fingers start losing their certainty, and the brain, which is trying to manage 17 other failing systems simultaneously, starts making small errors in the calculations that keep you on a rope. Mara went up the wall in 4 minutes and 12 seconds. The facility record, set 3 years earlier by a SEAL candidate who went on to serve 2 tours in the Pacific, was 4 minutes and 3 seconds. Nobody said anything about the 9 seconds. Nobody needed to. She crossed the checkpoint into the final stage, the problem, at 3 hours and 58 minutes. She had 22 minutes before the standard evaluation clock expired. The problem that day was a simulated hostage extraction scenario. 7 variables. 3 of them were designed to be unsolvable with the information provided, decoys, meant to consume time and cognitive bandwidth and reveal how a candidate behaved when they hit a wall. The correct approach was to identify the 3 unsolvable variables within the first 5 minutes, set them aside, and work the 4 that were actually tractable. Most candidates spent 12 to 15 minutes on the unsolvable variables. Mara spent 4, not because she was smarter than everyone in that facility. Because 18 months in a garage in Tucson, she had drilled a specific skill, identifying which problems were worth solving. It sounds obvious. It is not obvious. The human brain, under fatigue, under stress, under the particular kind of desperate optimism that comes from wanting to succeed, will spend enormous resources on problems that cannot be solved. It wants to solve them. It keeps trying. It doesn't want to give up. Mara had trained herself to give up on the right things. She solved the 4 tractable variables in 11 minutes. She handed in her solution at the 4-hour and 13-minute mark. 7 minutes under the standard evaluation clock. The proctor at the final checkpoint took her solution sheet. He read it. He was a man who had administered this assessment more than 100 times. He looked at her solution the way the registration desk man had looked at her credentials, twice, then a 3rd time, not from disbelief, but because he wanted to make sure he was seeing what he was seeing. He radioed Commander Ellis. There was a silence on the radio. Then, Ellis said, "Tell her to come to the main platform." She walked back through the course. Her ponytail had finally lost the battle with gravity entirely and was mostly just hair at this point. There was a cut on her left hand from the Jumar ascent. Not bad, already dried. The weighted vest was off. She'd handed it to a staff member at the final checkpoint. And without it, she felt briefly, absurdly light, the way you feel after carrying something heavy for a long time when the weight is finally gone and your body doesn't know yet what to do with the absence. The observation platforms were still full. 301 people. She walked past them. She wasn't looking at any of them. She was watching the ground in front of her feet, not from exhaustion, not from avoidance. Thinking, running the debrief in her head the way she always did, cataloging what had worked, what could be better, which variables she hadn't accounted for. The cut on her hand, the hydraulic tell in the water channel that she'd found but hadn't expected. She should have found it from the briefing diagram, which meant there was something about the way she read diagrams that she needed to address. She was thinking about this when the applause started. It wasn't polite applause. It wasn't the kind of applause that happens because it's expected or because there's a social contract about when to clap. It was the other kind, the kind that starts somewhere in the chest before it reaches the hands. It started in one section, then spread. She stopped walking. She looked up at the platforms. 301 people, standing. She stood there for a moment in the flat gray morning light, with her ruined ponytail and her dried cut and her borrowed gear, and she didn't know what to do with her face. So she just stood there and let it happen the way you stand in rain when you're already too wet to care about getting wetter. She had not come here to be seen. She had come here because a man in an auditorium had called her a kid. And she had decided, in the 4 seconds between hearing it and setting down her bag, that the most useful thing she could do with that word was give it back to him at 4 hours and 13 minutes, wrapped in a solution sheet and 11 miles of proof. The man who had said it was standing on the platform. He was clapping. He looked like a man who had just seen something he didn't have a category for yet and was quietly building one. Mara looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then she walked to the main platform to find Commander Ellis. She had questions about the hydraulic tell in the water channel. She wanted to know if it was intentional. Commander Ellis was a man who had built his entire professional identity around not being surprised. 22 years in the Navy will do that. You see enough things, enough missions go sideways, enough plans survive contact with reality for approximately 40 seconds before reality wins, and you develop a specific kind of immunity. Not callousness, immunity. The ability to receive information, regardless of how unexpected it is, without letting your face announce that you weren't expecting it. He was very good at this. He was not good at it for the next several minutes. He stood on a main platform and watched the solution sheet in his hand with the expression of a man who has just found a $20 bill in a coat he hasn't worn since last winter. Surprised, pleased, and slightly suspicious that he'd counted wrong. He'd had the same sheet evaluated by two of his senior staff during the 4 minutes it took Mara to walk from the final checkpoint to the platform, and both of them had come back with the same answer. Correct. Complete. No errors. Variable 3 had been approached through a lateral method Ellis hadn't seen used before, and it was, according to his head analyst, who communicated enthusiasm primarily through the speed at which he talked, and who was currently talking very fast, possibly the cleanest solution to the third variable I have ever personally seen, and I've been running this assessment for 6 years. Ellis looked up from the sheet. Mara was standing in front of him. She had her hands in her jacket pockets, and she was looking at him with an expression that was politely waiting and also, underneath the politeness, clearly thinking about something else. He said, "Miss Callahan." She said, "The hydraulic current at barrier 2 in the water channel. Is that intentional? It's not in the briefing diagram." Ellis looked at her. He said, "No, it's a construction artifact. We stopped noting it because nobody had found it in 3 years." She said, "You should put it in. It's useful information. It teaches candidates to listen to things that aren't in the briefing." Ellis said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I'll note that." Then he said, "Miss Callahan, I'd like to introduce you to some people." The people Ellis wanted to introduce her to were not, in fact, easy people to be introduced to. They were standing in a cluster near the edge of the platform, the way important people in institutional settings always cluster, not quite apart from everyone else, but generating a gravitational field that makes the space around them feel borrowed. 3 men, 2 women, various ranks and affiliations. The kind of credentials that don't appear on name tags because anyone in that room who needed to know them already knew them. Mara shook hands. She made eye contact. She answered questions. The questions were, at first, the predictable ones. How long had she been training? What was her athletic background? What program had produced the protocol she'd used? She answered them the way she always answered questions, directly, without performance, without the slightly inflated self-presentation that accomplishment sometimes teaches people to do. She said what was true. When she didn't know something, she said she didn't know. Then one of the women, Dr. Renata Voss, whose name Mara recognized from 3 research papers she'd read in Harold's garage, papers on physiological limits and military selection criteria, said, "The protocol. You designed it yourself?" Mara said, with correspondence input from Dr. Yitzhak Berman. Voss said, "Berman, the 2009 IDF study." Mara said, "Yes." Voss looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating a previous estimate. Not embarrassed by the recalibration, just doing it cleanly, the way a scientist is supposed to. She said, "How many subjects did you test the protocol on?" Mara said, "1." Voss said, "You." Mara said, "Yes." Voss said, "For how long?" Mara said, 18 months. Voss said, "In what facility?" Mara said, "A garage in Tucson." There was a pause. Voss looked at Ellis. Ellis looked at Voss. The look they exchanged was the kind of look that happens when 2 people who have spent careers looking for a specific and unusual thing have just realized they might be looking at it. The debrief session lasted 2 hours. It was held in a conference room inside the facility, and it was not the debrief Mara had been expecting, which was a polite review of her performance metrics with some technical questions about methodology. What it became, within about 15 minutes, was something closer to a graduate thesis defense, except that the committee was composed of people with active security clearances, and the subject matter kept running into corridors that required careful navigation. There were 9 people in the room. Mara was one of them. She sat at the end of the table with a glass of water. She kept forgetting to drink and answered everything they asked her. They asked about the plateau curve. She walked them through the data, the measurements, the 18 months of daily logs. They asked about the neurological fatigue findings. She explained the correspondence with Berman, the gap in the existing research, what she believed was happening at the cellular level, and where she was uncertain. They asked about the cognitive assessment at checkpoint 2. She talked through her approach, why she deprioritized the navigation instruments in favor of dead reckoning, what the reasoning had been. Halfway through the session, one of the men, a psychologist named Dr. Marcus Webb, who had said very little up to that point, and had been watching Mara the way a person watches a movie they suspect they're going to think about for a long time, said, "Miss Callahan, how old are you?" Mara said, 19. Webb said, asterisk, and you developed this protocol without institutional support, without a lab, without a research team, without, asterisk. Mara said, I had Harold. Webb said, I'm sorry. Mara said, my landlord. He brought tea. There was a pause. Then, somewhere in the room, someone laughed. It was the kind of laugh that breaks a tension nobody had consciously acknowledged was in the room. A few other people smiled. One of the uniformed men at the far end of the table, who had not smiled once during the entire debrief, showed, briefly, the ghost of something that might in the right light be called a smile. Webb said, and Harold aside, what made you think you could design a valid protocol on your own? Most researchers spend years developing methodological frameworks. Mara said, I know. I read a lot of them. She paused. Most of them were looking for the same shape. They kept measuring for the peak. I was measuring for the tail. Different question. You don't need a lab to ask a different question. Webb wrote something down. He wrote more than she'd expected. The man who had said they sent us a kid was not in the debrief room. His name was Senior Chief Petty Officer Daniel Reese, and he was 41 years old and had served in the Navy for 19 years, 12 of them as a SEAL. He was not in the debrief room because he had not been invited. The debrief was for researchers and select command personnel, and Reese was there as an evaluation observer, not a participant. He was in the facility cafeteria, sitting alone with a coffee, staring at the middle distance. He did this sometimes, after things that required recalibration. He learned years ago that the worst thing you could do after having your assumptions dismantled was to immediately paper over the gap with new assumptions. Better to sit in the gap for a while. Let be a gap. Look at it honestly. He was looking at it honestly. He was a fair man. He knew this about himself, not because someone had told him, but because he'd spent enough years watching unfair men. What they did, who they became, the specific kind of damage they left, to have decided very firmly what he was not going to be. He was not someone who carried prejudice he'd been called on. When he was wrong, he said so. Not loudly, not as a performance. Just to himself, or to whoever needed to hear it. He had been wrong. Not in the way people are wrong when they make an error of facts. In the way people are wrong when they look at a thing and see only the wrapper and don't bother opening it. He'd looked at a 19-year-old girl with a sideways ponytail and borrowed gear and made a calculation based on everything except the actual data. And she had spent 4 hours and 13 minutes generating data. He drank his coffee. He thought about what he'd seen. Not the headline of it. She finished the course, impressive, but the details, because details were where truth lived. The pacing in mile 1. The water channel. He'd run that channel 20 times, and he had never found a hydraulic tail at barrier 2, not once, and she'd found on a first run in murked water under time pressure. The way her form hadn't degraded. The way she'd moved through the rappelling section with something he could only call economy. No wasted motion, no negotiation between body and task, just the task happening. The cognitive checkpoints. He hadn't seen the solution sheet, but he'd spoken to a staff sergeant named Torres who had administered checkpoint 2, and Torres had described handing back the sheet in the particular way people describe things that surprise them. Slightly too casual, slightly too quick, like they were afraid of how surprised they actually were. Reese sat with his coffee. He made a decision. It was not a complicated decision. The complicated part had been the 20 minutes before it, where he sat in the gap and was honest about what he was looking at. Once you've done that part, the decision itself is usually simple. He got up. He went to find Commander Ellis. Ellis was wrapping up the debrief session when his aide told him Senior Chief Reese was outside asking to speak with him. Ellis told Mara they'd likely be in touch in the coming weeks, which was both an understatement and exactly as much as he was authorized to say at this stage. Mara said she'd be at the same address in Tucson. She said to give her regards to Dr. Voss. She picked up her bag and her borrowed jacket, and she left through the side door. Ellis found Reese in the hallway. Reese said, I'd like to speak with Miss Callahan. Ellis said, she just left. Side door. Reese said, thank you, sir. He went out the side door. Mara was in the parking lot, standing beside a car that was clearly not hers. A rented sedan that she'd gotten at the airport in San Diego, white, generic, indistinguishable from every other white sedan in every parking lot in America. She was leaning against the door with her phone out, texting someone, and she looked up when she heard footsteps. Reese stopped about 6 feet away. He said, Miss Callahan. She said yes. He said, I'm Senior Chief Petty Officer Daniel Reese. I was on the observation platform this morning. She looked at him the way she looked at rooms, taking inventory, not performing it. She said, I know which one you are. He said, I made a comment this morning that I want to address. She said nothing. She waited. He said, I said they sent us a kid. I said it because I looked at you and I made a judgment based on things that had nothing to do with your capability. That was wrong. And what you did today made it more wrong in ways I'm still working through. He paused. I wanted you to know I know that. Mara looked at him for a moment. Then, she said, do you know what the worst part about statements like that is? Reese said, tell me. She said, they're not even usually about the person they're aimed at. You weren't commenting on my capability. You didn't have any data on my capability. You were commenting on a surface reading, which means the statement was really about your system of reading surfaces, not about me. She paused, which would have been fine. Everyone has surface reading biases. That's just cognition. Except the statement was said out loud in a room full of people who were also taking surface readings, and it gave all of them permission to stop looking. She said it without heat, like she was explaining something mechanical, a thing that works a certain way that you can understand if you look at the mechanism clearly. Reese was quiet for a moment. He said, that's a fair analysis. She said, it's also the reason I asked for the full course instead of just presenting the research. He said, what do you mean? She said, I could have walked into that auditorium and talked for 30 minutes about physiological plateau curves and neural fatigue degradation rates, and people would have taken notes and nodded and filed it in the category of interesting research by someone we don't need to take seriously. She said it without bitterness, just as a fact. Data delivered by a source that doesn't look credible gets filtered before it lands. I needed to deliver the data in a format they couldn't filter. Reese looked at her. He said, you planned the whole thing. She said, I heard you say kid, and I made a decision, yes. He said, in 4 seconds. She said, 3. They talked for 40 minutes. In a parking lot, leaning against a rented sedan. The marine layer had started to burn off, and the light was shifting from flat gray to something warmer, the kind of California afternoon light that makes even concrete look like it has a good side. Reese asked her questions, real ones, not the performance of curiosity, but the actual thing. About the protocol, about the plateau curve, about what she thought the implications were for selection criteria and high-duration operations. She answered in the way she answered everything. Directly, with specificity, with I don't know deployed in exactly the places where she didn't know, and no others. At some point he asked her, what are you planning to do with this? She said, that depends on who asks me. He said, Dr. Voss. She said, yes, probably. He said, and if someone else asks? She said, then I want to know what they were planning to do with it. Reese nodded. He understood that completely. He said, fair. Then he said, Miss Callahan, what made you start? The protocol, the garage, all of it. What was the original question? She was quiet for a moment. She said, I got tired of being told that the shape of my performance was a deficit. He waited. She said, every assessment system I ever went through was calibrated for a single shape. You peak here, you maintain here, you decline here. That's the normal curve. And anything that doesn't match the normal curve gets flagged as underperforming. She looked at the ground for a second. I didn't peak where the system wanted me to peak. So for years, the system told me I wasn't quite good enough. Not bad, just not enough. Not a deficit exactly, but not what they were looking for. She said, and I kept thinking, not good enough for what? For the first hour? Sure, but what about the 4th hour? What about hour 6? What about the decision that has to be made at 3 in the morning after 2 days without sleep when everyone else's system has started producing errors? She said, asterisk, nobody was measuring for that. The assessment systems were measuring for the peak because that's what the designers of the systems had valued. And I thought, asterisk, she paused. What if the thing you're measuring for isn't the thing that actually matters at the end? Reese was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in 19 years I have had exactly one assessment come back and make me feel like something I understood about selection was actually wrong. She said, what was it? He said, what you did today. She drove back towards San Diego in the white rented sedan. The radio was off. She drove the way she did most things, with the comfortable silence of a person who doesn't require noise to feel okay in their own company. The coast road was beautiful in the late afternoon light, the Pacific doing what the Pacific does in California autumn. Blue that's almost too blue to be a real color. White caps running, the whole thing looking like it had been art directed by someone showing off. She thought about the debrief. She thought about Voss and Webb and Ellis and what they might be discussing right now in whatever conference room they'd moved to after she left. She thought about Reese in the parking lot. She thought about her father, Ray Callahan, who was currently in Oklahoma making dinner, probably something from a can, heated up, eaten standing at the counter because Ray Callahan viewed sitting down for meals alone as an unnecessary formality, and who did not know any of this had happened today because she hadn't told him she was coming out here. Not because she wanted to hide it, because she hadn't wanted to carry anyone else's expectations into the room with her. She wanted to walk in clean. She'd wanted the results to be only hers. She pulled off at a viewpoint on the coast road, a small pull-off with 2 other cars and a dog on a leash and a man eating a sandwich, and she sat there for a few minutes looking at the ocean. She thought about the water channel, the hydraulic tell at Barrier 2. She thought about Harold and his orchids. She took out her phone. She texted her father, "Hey, I did a thing today. I'll tell you about it when I'm back." He texted back in 30 seconds. He always texted back in 30 seconds, even though he refused to replace the landline, which was a specific contradiction that was Ray Callahan. And the text said, "Good thing or bad thing?" She looked at the ocean. She texted, "Good, I think." Still working out where to put it. He texted, "Take your time." She put the phone in the cup holder. She sat with the ocean for another few minutes, and then she pulled back onto the road toward the airport. 12 days later, Dr. Voss called. Mara was in the garage, working through a revision to one of the protocol's recovery intervals. She had the garage door open, and Harold was in his garden 14 feet away, doing something deliberate with a watering can that suggested he was listening to the conversation without appearing to be. Voss said, "Miss Callahan, we've had some discussions following your demonstration that I'd like to talk to you about directly." Mara said, "Okay." Voss said, "There are several people who are interested in developing what you've done into something with broader application. That's going to require formal infrastructure, a research environment, proper instrumentation, a team, and a longer conversation about what that would look like and what you'd need." Mara said, "What kind of broader application?" Voss said, "Selection criteria, performance assessment design, potentially reframing some foundational assumptions about what constitutes optimal candidates for high-duration operations." Mara said, "Specifically." Voss said, "Ms. Callahan, you may have identified a performance profile that existing selection systems structurally exclude." Mara said, "I know. That's why I built the protocol." Voss said, "We'd like to understand how many people that profile might include." Mara sat on the garage floor, cross-legged, her back against the faded workbench. Harold had stopped moving the watering can. She said, "I need to know more about the structure of the research environment. Who controls the methodology? Who owns the findings?" Voss said, "Those are the right questions." Mara said, "I know." She said, "Set up a call. Give me Dr. Webb, too. And if Reese is in a position to be part of that conversation, I'd want him there." There was a brief pause. Voss said, "Why Reese?" Mara said, "Because he's the first person in that building who talked to me like I was someone worth talking to. And people like that are useful in rooms where assumptions need to be revised." Voss was quiet for a moment. She said, "I'll set up." She said, "Miss Callahan, what made you ask for the full course?" In the moment, standing in that auditorium, what actually went through your head? Mara thought about this. She said, "I heard someone say kid, and I thought, okay, then let's find out what a kid can do in 4 hours and 13 minutes. Voss said, "You finished in 4:13. Mara said, "Yes." Voss said, "The record is 4:3. Mara said, "I know. I was thinking about the hydraulic tell. I lost 9 seconds recalibrating after I found it." She said, "I won't lose them next time." Outside, Harold picked up his watering can and resumed tending to the orchids very slowly in the direction away from the garage door. He had the expression of a man who had been bringing tea to someone important for 18 months without knowing it. He seemed, in this moment, deeply fine with that. The room they gave her was not impressive. That was her first thought when she walked into the research facility in Virginia for the first time. Not about the program, not about the people, not about what the next chapter of her life was apparently going to look like. About the room. It was a corner office on the 2nd floor of a building that was doing its best to look like it was not affiliated with the Department of Defense, which meant it looked like every medium-quality office building that had been built between 1987 and 1995, beige and earnest and faintly optimistic about its own carpeting. The room had a window that faced a parking lot. There were 2 chairs and a desk and a whiteboard that still had someone else's equations on it, something about regression variables, and a note in red marker that said, "Ask Chun about this," and then an arrow that led nowhere. Mara stood in the doorway with her bag. She said, "This is great." She meant it, which is the thing about Mara that people took a while to understand, that her effect was not a mask and her words were not a performance. When she said the room was great, she was looking at the whiteboard, someone else's equations, an arrow going nowhere, questions left open in red marker by a person she'd never met. She was home. She set her bag on the desk and found a marker and started writing. The formal name of the program was the Human Performance Optimization Research Initiative, which abbreviated to PORI and was pronounced by everyone in the building as hypery in a way that suggested either affection or mild embarrassment about the acronym. It operated under the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, with civilian research oversight from Dr. Voss's team and a joint advisory panel that included, as of 3 months after the demonstration at the San Diego facility, Senior Chief Petty Officer Daniel Reese in a newly created liaison role that nobody had a clean title for yet. Ellis had made it happen. It had taken Ellis approximately 11 days from the moment Mara left the parking lot to decide that what he'd seen required institutional response. And Ellis was a man who moved through bureaucracy the way some people move through crowds, not by brute force, but by knowing exactly which elbows to nudge and in what sequence. By the end of week 2, he had 3 signatures. By the end of week 4, he had a budget line. By the end of week 8, he had a facility, a team allocation, and a research mandate that was on paper conservative and measured and appropriately hedged, and was in practice an invitation to Mara Callahan to do whatever she had been doing in Harold's garage, but with equipment that wasn't held together with zip ties and determination. She packed her garage logs in a single cardboard box. They filled a banker's box plus 1 overflow folder. Harold had come out to watch her load the car. He said, "Will you be coming back?" She said, "I don't know yet." He said, "I won't rent the space immediately." She said, "You should rent it. I can work anywhere." He looked at the garage. He looked at her. He said, "You sure changed the energy of this place." He said it the way you describe a weather pattern, a thing that had happened, observable, factual. It was just a garage before. She got in the car. She drove east. The team they assembled for PORI was 5 people initially, with the understanding that it would expand as the research generated findings worth expanding around. This is how institutional research works. You don't get the full budget until you've proven you deserve it, which means you do the work that proves you deserve it with insufficient resources, which is its own particular kind of test. Dr. Voss headed the research oversight. Dr. Webb handled the psychological assessment components. A physiologist named Dr. Caleb Torres, no relation to the checkpoint sergeant, though Mara found the coincidence pleasing, came from a sports science lab in Colorado where he had spent 8 years studying endurance athletes. He had read Mara's methodology logs before the first team meeting and had sent her an 8-page annotated response that was, in equal measure, the most intellectually engaged and the most technically aggressive document she had ever received. His opening line was, "Your methodology is excellent. Your variable isolation in months 3 through 7 is genuinely innovative, and your control conditions in month 14 are an absolute disaster." She'd read it twice. She'd written back, "You're right about month 14. I know. Get on a plane." He got on a plane. The 4th team member was a data analyst named Jordan Kim, who was 26 and who processed information at a speed that occasionally made Mara feel like her own brain was running a firmware version behind. Jordan spoke primarily in precise sentences that contained no filler words whatsoever. No like, no sort of, which Mara found so efficient, and so different from almost every other human she'd encountered that she spent the first 2 weeks subtly timing Jordan's average sentence length and comparing it to her own. She did not share the results of this analysis. The 5th member was Reese. His role was technically advisory, operational context for the research, a working knowledge of what hydration field conditions actually looked like from the inside, and a credibility bridge between the research team and the operational community whose assessment criteria they were proposing to revise. In practice, what Reese did was sit in the corner of the lab with a coffee and ask questions that sounded simple and turn out not to be. He had a gift for it. On his second day, he looked at a data visualization Jordan had built to model the performance degradation curves of 200 test subjects and said, "What's that cluster in the lower right?" Jordan said, "Outliers. They're below the degradation floor of the standard model." Reese said, "Below the floor in which direction?" Jordan said, "They degrade more slowly than the standard model accounts for." Reese said, "So they're not outliers. They're a category you don't have a model for yet." Jordan looked at the visualization, looked at Reese, said, "Yes, that's what they are." Reese said, "How many of them?" Jordan said, 17. Out of 200 subjects. Reese said, 8.5%. He looked at Mara. She was already looking at him. She said, 17 is a lot. He said, "It is." She said, "Asterisk if 17 out of every 200 candidates have a performance profile that current assessment systems don't have a model for." Asterisk, he said. "Then we've been filtering out 8.5% of our best candidates based on how they perform in the first hour." The room was quiet. Torres said, "I want to be careful about the word best. They're not best in the traditional metric." Mara said, "Reframe the metric." Torres said, "That's what we're here to do." The first real test came at the 4-month mark. Not a test they planned. The kind that shows up unannounced, which is the only kind that tells you anything true about whether what you've built is actually as solid as you thought it was. The test was a man named Brigadier General Leonard Hatch. Hatch was 63 years old and had opinions about most things, particularly about the things he had built, and one of the things he had built, or overseeing the building of, which he experienced as functionally equivalent, was the current candidate selection framework for special operations programs. He had been briefed on PORI twice, once 3 months ago when it was new, and he had filed in a mental folder labeled interesting but not my problem, and once 2 weeks ago when Ellis had escalated a preliminary findings brief that landed on Hatch's desk and apparently produced a reaction that Ellis described to Mara as, "I've never seen him read something that quickly." Hatch came to the facility on a Tuesday. He did not announce he was coming. He arrived at 9 in the morning with 2 aides and no advance notice, walked into the lab where the team was running a morning data review, stood in the doorway for a moment watching, and then said, "Who's Callahan?" Mara raised her hand from her seat at the central table. He said, "I want to understand your sample size." She said, "Pull up a chair." He did. What followed was 3 hours. Hatch was not a hostile man. He was a rigorous one, which is something different and, in Mara's experience, rarer. He did not ask questions to find weaknesses in the research. He asked them to understand the research, which required him to also find the weaknesses, but the purpose was different. The purpose was comprehension. He'd built his career on a selection framework he believed in, and he was sitting in this room because a preliminary brief had suggested that the framework had a structural gap in it, and he wanted to know if that was true before he decided what to do about it. He asked about the 17 outliers. Jordan pulled the visualization. He looked at it for a long time. He asked about the historical data. Had they run the plateau curve model against existing SEAL candidates? Against current active duty special operations personnel? Torres said yes. We ran it against service records from 240 current active duty personnel across 4 branches. Hatch said, and? Torres said, 22 individuals show the plateau profile in their service records if you know what to look for. Hatch said, how do you find it in a service record? Torres said, asterisk long duration operational performance versus short duration assessment scores. In almost every case, there's a gap. The assessment scores are asterisk, he paused, choosing the word. Adequate, not exceptional, but the long-duration operational performance is consistently above the statistical average for their unit. Hatch said, you're telling me 22 of my people have been performing at a level their assessment scores don't predict. Torres said, for their entire careers. Hatch looked at the table. He was quiet for a long time. He said, and how many were filtered out before they got in? Torres said, we can't know that directly. But if the profile exists in roughly 8 to 9% of a general population, Hatch said, do the math. Jordan said, over the past 10 years of selection cycles across the programs we have access to data from. And this is a conservative estimate, somewhere between 200 and 340 individuals with a plateau profile were likely assessed and filtered out. Hatch looked at the table. He said, they didn't score well enough on the peak-dependent assessments. Jordan said, correct. He said, so they were told they weren't good enough. Nobody in the room answered. because there was nothing to say that wasn't already in the silence. Hatch put both hands flat on the table. He took a breath. He said, "What do you need?" What they needed was a validation study. Not because anyone in that room doubted the data, but because institutional change at the scale they were proposing, a structural revision to selection criteria that had been in place for decades in programs that had been built around those criteria by people who had succeeded inside those criteria, required a level of evidentiary weight that your preliminary findings, however compelling, could not provide alone. You needed the study. You needed the replication. You needed the data to speak loud enough that it could not be reinterpreted as an anomaly or a funding experiment or a researcher's wish projected onto a small sample. Hatchett said, "What do you need?" Mara had told him. He had provided it within a week, which was, according to Ellis, who had never seen Hatch move that fast on anything, a personal record. The validation study ran over 7 months. 412 subjects drawn from active duty candidates across 3 branches. Randomized, blind assessed, full protocol developed from Mara's garage methodology, instrumented now with equipment that measured things she'd had to estimate in Tucson. Continuous EEG monitoring during cognitive checkpoint tasks, real-time cortisol, and lactate tracking, a dozen biometric variables that the team had spent 3 months arguing about, and finally agreed upon. Mara ran the study. She did not just oversee it. She ran it. The way she'd run the garage protocol, the way she'd run the course in San Diego. Personally, obsessively, with daily log reviews and weekly calibration meetings, and the particular quality of attention that looks, to people unfamiliar with it, like workaholism, and is actually something more specific. The attention of a person who knows that the difference between a study that changes something and a study that gets filed away is the difference between data that is airtight and data that has a hairline crack someone can quietly point to in 3 years and say, well, there's always this issue with the methodology. She was not going to have a hairline crack. Torres slept 4 nights on a lab couch during month 5 when a data irregularity showed up in the week 3 readings of subject group C. The irregularity was eventually traced to a calibration error in one of the biometric sensors. She threw out the week 3 readings for group C and ran them again. Torres said, "That's 3 weeks of data." She said, "I know." He said, "We're going to be 2 months behind schedule." She said, "I know." He said, "Do you want to?" She said, "No." He said, "Okay." He didn't finish his question. He already knew her answer to every version of it. We're not keeping compromised data was not a policy she had written down. It was just the specific shape of who she was. Reese came to the lab on a Thursday in month 6. He was not scheduled to be there. His advisory role had become increasingly informal as the study progressed, which meant he showed up when he thought he had something useful and didn't when he didn't, an arrangement that suited everyone, including him. He showed up that Thursday with 2 coffees and stood in the doorway and said, "You got a minute?" Mara was at the central table with a stack of session logs. She said, "Technically no, but you brought 2 coffees, so probably yes." He sat down. He put a coffee in front of her. He said, "I spoke to someone yesterday, a retired master chief named Al Guerrero. He was SEAL for 20 years. Got out about 6 years ago." She took the coffee. He said, "I've known Al for a long time. He was on the evaluation board for the program I came up through. He was the one who almost didn't pass me." Mara said, "Why almost?" Reese said, "My peak assessment scores, specifically the early phase cognitive assessments. I was below the cutoff on week 1. He paused. Asterisk, Al passed me because of something a training instructor had said in my evaluation notes. The instructor wrote, asterisk, he stopped. He looked at the table. He wrote, this candidate does not perform well under short duration maximum stress. He performs exceptionally well under everything else. Mara looked at him. He said, Al took a chance. 20 years later, he told me he didn't know why. He just had a feeling. She said, he didn't have a feeling. He read the data correctly. Reese said, right? But he read it right by instinct. With no framework, no methodology, no language for what he was looking at. He leaned forward. How many ALS were there, Mara? And how many of them didn't have the instinct? She looked at the stack of session logs. She thought about the 340. She thought about the 200 candidates in the San Diego auditorium who had never been asked to sit in a chair and take a different test because nobody had designed a different test yet. She thought about a water channel in San Diego and a hydraulic tell at Barrier 2 that nobody had put in the briefing diagram because nobody had noticed it in 3 years. Not because it wasn't there, because they hadn't been looking. She said, "That's what this is for." He said, "I know." He paused. "I just wanted to say it out loud to you, because I've been watching you for 6 months work at a pace that I can barely track, and I know why you're doing it, and I wanted you to hear that I know why you're doing it." She looked at him. She said, "You heard yourself say kid in that auditorium, and you've been carrying that around." He didn't say anything. She said, "Don't. You corrected it the same day. That's what you're supposed to do when you're wrong about something." He said, "It doesn't feel like enough." She said, "It never does. That's what keeps it from happening again." She picked up the coffee. "Now stop interrupting me. I have month 6 logs to get through." He got up. He said, "I'll ask me to say hello to you." She said, "How does I'll know who I am?" Reese said, "He read the preliminary brief." She said, "What did he say?" Reese was at the door. He turned back. He said he wished someone had written the framework before he had to trust his gut. A pause. He also said, and I'm quoting, "She sounds like exactly the kind of kid who would have driven me insane to evaluate." He meant it as a compliment. Mara said, "I know he did." The door closed. She sat alone in the lab with the stack of logs and the coffee and the whiteboard behind her that was covered in her own equations now. The other person's red marker questions long since erased, replaced with different questions, equally open, arrows going in directions that were starting to look like somewhere. She thought about 19 years old. She thought about a wrestling gym in Oklahoma that smelled like rubber mats and old lunch, and her father in a folding chair with a torn armrest, watching her without saying anything, knowing something about her that she was still, in some ways, just beginning to find the edges of. She thought about the 7 months of data sitting in folders on the server behind her. 412 subjects. Instruments measuring things she'd had to guess at in Tucson. A validation study that was going to land on Hatch's desk in 4 weeks and say, in the precise and unhairline cracked language of airtight methodology, "You've been asking the wrong question, and here's the right one. And here's what the right one finds." She picked up a pen. She opened the next log. She started reading. Outside the window, the parking lot was ordinary and gray and completely fine. She didn't notice it. She was already somewhere else.